Hello, students. I hope everybody had a great break. I will continue with the sexual and gender-based violence lecture from the last class. Then I will address masculinity and peace building. Throughout this screencast, I will be asking you to answer questions. I would like you to submit both the questions and the answers to me via email no later than 11:59 p.m. on Thursday, March 28th. These answers will count as 2 participation grades. So again, make sure you write both the question and the answers. So we're going to begin with talking about sexual and gender-based violence and conflict. Sexual and gender-based violence is recognized as a human rights violation. The World Bank indicates that levels of sexual violence may escalate during conflict and that the effects can persist long after the formal conflict has ended, as we have discussed this in class. The global estimate is that 35%, or 1 in 3 women, have experienced physical violence in their lifetime. But in conflict-affected areas, rates are usually higher. So for example, Mike and Dan presented on the Democratic Republic of the Congo that's been plagued by civil conflict and war for decades. And one of the studies finds that up to 40% of women have experienced sexual violence in their lifetime in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. During times of conflict and instability, it can also pose significant security challenges because violence is normalized and sexualized violence is often used to punish and terrorize populations or fuel displacement, and it destroys the fabric of the communities. Sexualized violence against civilians is one of the most common forms of human rights violations in many conflicts and crisis situations. And often rape is used as a systematic weapon of warfare with the aim to torture and humiliate the victims and their families, to destroy the fabric of the community, and to demoralize the enemy. As we spoke about in last class, sexual and gender-based violence is always an act of domination or power, grounded in cultural perceptions of what constitutes identities of masculinity and femininity. Women and children, unfortunately, form the vast majority of victims of sexualized violence, although men also become victims of sexualized violence, although less often. And in terms of post-war integration, survivors of violence often face significant difficulties assessing the resources necessary to reintegrate into society. Yet, there is hope because the International Criminal Court in 1998 recognized rape for the first time as a war crime, which is an important step towards fighting the impunity of sexual violence in armed conflict. What I'd like you to do now is watch this video on Bosnia's rape camps. This took place in the Yugoslavian Civil War in the 1990s. In the Word document or a Google Doc, please type the question that you see above and then answer it. And the question is it better to bury this egregious past or to memorialize it, and then explain it? So please take a moment to watch this video and answer that question in a Word document or Google document. There are several steps that can be taken to prevent sexual and gender-based violence. The first is advocacy. For over 2 decades, women's advocacy groups around the world have been working to draw more attention to the physical, psychological, and sexual abuse of women, and to stress the need for action. The second is protection in the form of shelter for women who have been abused. The third is legal action. As we stated in terms of advocacy, there have been several groups that have lobbied for legal reforms, and we've seen the result as the example of the International Criminal Court making rape a war crime. Fourth is this idea of constructivism, where groups challenge the widespread attitudes and beliefs that support violent behavior against women, as well as engaging men as allies to change social norms. So constructivism is trying to change the minds and to change the belief system. Fifth is education. which is a critical step to overcoming the power dynamics and inequality that fosters conditions in which gender-based violence occurs and is through education. Learning about legal rights can shift social norms and deter perpetrators of violence and increase women's confidence to raise their voices about the critical issues affecting their lives. When women know their rights and have the financial means to stand on their own feet, then they're more likely to be able to break free of the violence and recover from it. Sixth are the international institutions that support these initiatives, like the World Bank. Since 2012, 12 new projects with an exclusive or priority focus on sexual and gender-based violence, totaling 18.6 million, have been approved. The World Bank gave a $75 million loan that focuses on sexual and gender-based violence in Africa's Great Lakes region. And the State and Peacebuilding Fund proposal has been approved for a $12 million strategic initiative to pilot promising interventions and promote knowledge and sharing across 6 fragile countries about sexual and gender-based violence. At the micro level, increasing women's access to assets such as land or housing is frequently proposed as a strategy to empower women and to reduce their vulnerability. However, studies on the impact of sexual and gender-based violence is mixed in terms of giving the land or housing to women, because men may react harshly to women receiving financial power if it's outside their gender norm within that culture. The United Nations is another institution that supports sexual and gender-based violence prevention. They have created awareness campaigns. The United Nations, its partner organizations, and governments around the world have galvanized attention to gender-based violence through what they call the 16 Days of Activism, starting on the International Day for the Elimination of Violence Against Women on November 25th. There are also local supports for victims of sexual and gender-based violence. The first is establishing a focal person within the community. Because of shame and fear, rape survivors and generally victims of gender-based violence often do not seek help, but have to be offered support proactively. Therefore, a system that reaches out to women is vital. So focal persons should be identified in the communities, keeping in mind that these women should also work with other people in need. A focal person in the community should have the capacity for empathy with women who are rejected by society and the confidence that is required to successfully negotiate with family and community members. The second thing is to create spaces where women can speak about their experience in a safe manner. There is also a need for outreach for men. Men are affected by sexual and gender-based violence as direct victims or indirectly as husbands or fathers of women who were raped, and also as perpetrators. The stigmatization and ridicule of male victims is usually severe. So when rape of men occurs, engaging male counselors and sensitization work on the impact of rape of men is a must. There's also a need for a sensitization and awareness, which means addressing social taboos. So starting a community dialogue about gender relations and violence to remove the stigma. And finally, justice for the victims acknowledges publicly the harm that the survivor has experienced and contributes to the rehabilitation process. That is the last part of our lecture on sexual and gender-based violence. So right now I'd like to talk to you a little bit about the research paper proposal and annotated bibliography. Overall, just like the first reading memo, I would say most of the students struggled with this assignment. So what you see on the slides are what you guys struggled with, not all of you, but many of you. If you received a lower grade than you anticipated, I will allow you to resubmit your research paper proposal and annotated bibliography. I will average both your old grade or the original grade and the new grade to give you an averaged grade. And also to help you, I will post an example research paper and annotated bibliography on Canvas so you can see what is expected in your writing. So let's talk about some of the things that I noticed as a pattern overall. In terms of the background to the conflict, you should just address the basic information. So think of like the who, what, when, wheres, and whys. When did the conflict occur? Why did the conflict occur? Who's involved? Okay, so these are the basics that everybody should have in their research paper. And it's 5 to 10 sentences. Okay. Some of you decided to use identarism as part of your war theory, which is great. But you have to assume that even though we know the answers, when you write a research paper, you define things like identarism. Okay, so don't just mention it, you need to define it as Ferguson did. One of the things overall that almost everyone had trouble with is citing information. Just like the reading memo, you're going to cite every single sentence that is not your fact or observation, every single one. You use IBIDs. So if you're going over and over and over, just use IBID, okay? But there's also a problem that I saw. There were some cases where students used the same source for 13 footnotes, okay? You cannot use the same source over and over again. That's considered plagiarism. So instead, there are other sources that you can use that say the same thing, especially if it's just basic facts about the conflict. In terms of the annotated bibliography, some of you chose to put in books. Some of you chose to put in magazine articles, and I'm looking for peer-reviewed. When you go onto the TCNJ library website and when you start searching, you can search for just peer-reviewed articles, okay? So I had to take off points if you did not use the proper source, okay? And let me remind you that that proper source also needs to be used in your research paper. I will be checking that. Also, just like a reading memo, you need to include the page numbers, okay? Again, I need to see where this information is coming from. And that is extremely important because that is an issue of plagiarism. If you receive that low grade and you want to resubmit, you're absolutely welcome to. You need to resubmit by Tuesday, April 2nd by 2 p.m. And again, I will post an example research paper and annotated bibliography so you can compare yours to the one that's the exemplar. Now I'll begin the discussion of masculinity and peacebuilding. What I would like you to do is go to this New York Times article, and I would like you to answer some of these questions, but not all of these because I think it's too much. So let me just take out a couple of these here. All right, so what I'd like you to do is answer the following questions. Do you agree with Michael Ian Black's observations? Has there been too much emphasis on the empowerment of women and girls? And for the gentlemen in the class, do you feel that you are losing out on opportunities as a result of the empowerment of women? So please read the New York Times article, answer those questions in the same document where you answer the questions about the Bosnian rape camps. Okay, now that you've read that article, I also want you to look at this United Nations video on men, peace, and security as agents of change, okay? I would also like you to answer the questions that you see on the screen as well. What do these experts propose as solutions for men to unlearn violence? And what surprised you about this video? Again, it's going to go on the same document that you put the answers to the other questions about the article and the Bosnian rape camps. Before we get into masculinity, it's a good idea to remind you about the key terms regarding gender and how they're defined. Gender refers to the characteristics and behaviors that a society or culture associates with males and females. The terms masculine and feminine are usually used to describe gender. Gender identity is an individual's deeply held sense of being male, female, or another gender. And what's important to remember that this is separate from biological sex. And finally, gender expression can be defined as the way we show our gender to the world. Societal expectations of gender expression are reinforced in almost every area of life. Even very young children are clear about the gendered choices that boys and girls are supposed to make in relation to toys, colors, games, and activities. So let's look at what masculinity is, okay? Because femininities and masculinities are gender identities, they are shaped by socio-cultural processes, not biology. Femininities and masculinities are plural. There are many forms of femininity and many forms of masculinity. What gets defined as feminine or masculine differs by region, religion, class, national culture, and other social factors. How femininities and masculinities are valued differs culturally. So cultural notions of feminine and masculine behavior are shaped in part by observations about what men and women do. Please keep in mind that femininities and masculinities are learned. Messages about feminine and masculine behaviors are embedded in advertising and the media, the news, educational materials, and so forth. These messages are present in a range of environments, from the home to the workplace to public spaces. And from an early age, little boys learn that they are expected to be tough at all times in our culture. As socially constructed identities, boys and men learn appropriate, in quotes, gender roles in accordance to the masculine expectations of their given society. This means that from a very early on, boys get messages on what it means to be a boy. And sadly, boys and men are punished, often by other boys and men, in a particularly gendered manner. So for example, if boys and men do not meet the expectations of being a man, they are often called homophobic or feminizing slurs. These degradations work to police the boundaries of what is acceptable appearance and behavior for boys and men, which is one explanation as to why gender roles in our society are still rigidly defined and vigilantly enforced. All men are influenced by their upbringing, their experience, and their social environment, which play a big role in determining one's view of masculinity and manhood. So this means that masculinity is going to be different for everyone. Some particularly influential factors in shaping one's idea of manhood are race, class, ability, sexual orientation, gender, and of course, culture. So think about our culture. In American culture, from an early age, little boys learn that they are expected to be tough at all times. They learn that the only acceptable emotion that they can show without fear of ridicule is anger. They learn to solve problems and express their frustration with their fists or by playing rough with other little boys. They learn that because of their gender, they need to bottle up their emotions and just, quote, deal with their issues. So what I'd like you to do now is I would like you to answer the question that's on the screen. What were the gender expectations for you growing up? Think about how your parents reacted to any issues on gender. Did you reflect them, or did you have a different point of view? So on the same paper, please write the answer to that question. What were the gender expectations for you growing up? We have a global problem with masculinity and violence. Let me give you some statistics. Men's life expectancy is lower than that of women. Men have more accidents, they fill the prisons and top criminal statistics, and are the ones who are almost exclusively that take the decisions that lead to armed conflict and war. Average figures from Europe, the United States, and Australia have shown that men stand charged for between 80 to 90% of all violent crimes. Not only is male violence directed towards women, statistics show that men are more often than not victims of other men's violence. And in private life too, men are more likely to be armed and violent. In the United States, careful research by criminologists have established that private gun ownership runs 4 times as high among men as among women. Body contact sports such as boxing and football involve ritualized combat and often physical injury. These sports are almost exclusively practiced by men. Dangerous driving is increasingly recognized as a form of violence. It's usually done by men. Young men die on the roads at a rate 4 times that of young women and kill at even a higher ratio. And older men, as corporate executives, make the decisions that result in injury or death from the actions of their businesses. Industrial injuries to their workers, pollution, injury to neighbors, and environmental destruction. And as we know, masculinity and conflict are connected. But analysis of masculinity remains largely absent in the political, policy, and media communities that come together around war. And this is very important, especially to our class looking at peace building. Even though it's mainly men who are responsible for the horrors of war. The cultures and institutions that prepare for and deliver organized armed violence on behalf of the state or non-state armed groups are predominantly constructed by men, or led by men, or filled by men. Yet, as there are today with women fighters at the front line, senior women military strategists and women heads of state also take their countries into war. But the evidence still tells us that it's mainly men who organize and deliver violence. Yet suffering, on the other hand, is stereotyped as a largely female problem with a foregrounding of the pain of women and children. Some female-focused policies of aid could verge on breaching the principle of impartiality, which is based on need alone and not identity. Because men suffer terribly in war as well, and many resist the mainly male violence of a conflict and nonviolently support the rescue and survival of their families. Looking at military culture, research indicates that military cultures tend to foster attitudes that are demeaning to women through training, violence, and sexist language, images, jokes, drill chants, and songs. And something else to consider is that the world military expenditure is estimated to have been $1,686 billion in 2016. That's the whole world. That's equivalent to 2.2% of the global gross domestic product, or $227 a person. Other things to consider is that 30 million members of the world's armed forces today are overwhelmingly male. In many countries, all soldiers are men, and even in those countries that admit women to the military, commanders are almost exclusively men. Men also dominate other branches of enforcement, such as the public sector, police officers and prison guards, and in the private sector as security agents. So keep this in mind, all these statistics, when it comes to our peace building. I asked you to read Hannah Wright's Masculinities, Conflict, and Peacebuilding, Perspectives on Men Through a Gendered Lens by Hannah Wright. So I'm just going to briefly describe what she talked about in her research. So she examined the dynamics of masculinity and violence in her report that we just talked about. And she observed that gender roles often incite men to participate in violence in an attempt to prove their masculinity or to regain it. And this is problematic because an ongoing cycle is produced in which gender stereotypes perpetuate violence and vice versa. So Wright recommends studying the structures in which gender norms are reinforced rather than the enforcers themselves. This way, peace builders can end the cycle that toxic masculinity sustains. So that's the gist of the article, but I wanted to focus on a couple of points that Hannah Wright speaks to. First, a very important point, Wright states that, and I'm quoting right from the article, quote, "It's been noted in a range of contexts that the concentration of development programming on women's empowerment has left men feeling excluded and their masculinity threatened, which has created tensions within families and communities and may have led to increases in violence against women." So this is something that I've noticed too, and it's a controversial point, and if I were there, we would discuss this. In the last 20 or 30 years, there has been a push to raise up girls but leave boys behind. So if you look at like college statistics or high school statistics, you'll see that more girls than boys, more men than women are graduating. And as a result, there's a loss of empowerment to boys and men. And I believe that Michael Ian Black's article that you just read is speaking to this resentment. I'd like you to think about that and what Hannah Wright is saying about that these development programs, this push for empowerment of women, have left men behind, or at least the perception. So I'd like you to answer this question, okay? Do you agree with Hannah Wright in terms of that this empowerment has left boys behind? Do you believe that this empowerment of women and girls have left men and boys behind? And what would be a possible solution? What would be a possible solution? So those are two questions that I would like you to add to the questions and the answers on that same document. Another thing that Hannah Wright brings up in her article is women and masculinity. And some of the things that women do are toxic as well. Women put pressure on men to commit violence. Not all women, but in the case of like in certain situations, thereby reinforcing dominant conceptions of violent masculinity, which complement ideas of passive femininity. And sometimes in these cases, women prefer the more violent male because it reinforces the stereotypes that they may not be aware of. There are existing approaches to transforming masculinities, and I want you to keep this slide in mind when you create your policy brief at the end of the semester as examples of peace-building mechanisms, because that's what you're going to do as your last assignment of the year. You're going to create a policy brief for the conflict that you are writing about currently. You're going to look at the social, the justice mechanisms, restorative and retributive, as well as other peace mechanisms, and see if they're working. So these existing approaches, there are three. First, there's the group education strategies. And these are efforts undertaken to bring men together in formal or semi-formal settings in order to implement training activities or different types, such as courses, workshops, or seminars. So what does it look like? The use of participatory methodologies in group activities with boys and men aim to stimulate in-depth reflection and analysis and to engage them emotionally as well as rationally. So participants are encouraged to identify and examine their own attitudes, their values, and their behaviors to understand how they may uphold patriarchal norms, and in addition, propose strategies for change, which begin with making changes in their own lives. It allows these men and boys to analyze the processes of gender socialization, which they themselves experienced as boys growing up. So there's a bit of self-awareness there. And it engages men emotionally as well as rationally. So for example, in an evaluation of their programming to transform men's attitudes toward gender-based violence, the International Rescue Committee found that it was also important to work with women to challenge gender norms that they have internalized, which justify discrimination and violence against them. Those who participated in group education report significant changes in many specific attitudes and behaviors that were measured. So the second one is community outreach strategies. These are activities aimed at influencing culturally ingrained attitudes or values and behaviors on a wider scale. This is included through mass media campaigns, the distribution of educational and informational materials, rallies, marches, cultural events like theater, and the training of activists to reach other men and organize community activities. Similarly, some use particularly influential men, such as celebrities, sports personalities, or political leaders, in their media output to garner more attention and position them as role models. And finally, integrated strategies. These programs use a combination of group education and community outreach strategies in a mutually complementary way. So it's using both. Evidence suggests that programs which integrate group education with community outreach and mass media campaigns are the most effective in changing behavior. What I'd like you to do now is watch the two videos that you see on these two slides. After you watch the videos, I would like you to write the question and the answer in your Google or Word doc. The question is found on the second slide that you see here. Then I asked you to read Kimberly Thaden's Reconstructing Masculinities, the Disarmament, Demobilization, and Reintegration of Former Combatants in Colombia. The point of her article was successful reintegration not only requires fusing the processes and goals of DDR programs with transitional justice measures, but that both DDR and transitional justice required a gendered analysis that includes an examination of the links between weapons, masculinity, and violence. So she talks about these DDR programs, which is what's called disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration. And in order to do that, combatants have to lay down their weapons, governments have to end their conflict, and the communities must receive or reject demobilized fighters. She talks a bit about why boys and men join the forces and the armed forces, and she said it's a reinforcement of masculinity. She gives this example. One of the former soldiers says, "Everyone treats me with respect. It's not like it was before. When I walk down the street, people move out of my way. Now I can send my mom 350,000 pesos a month. She's doing all right now. I even saved up and bought my mom a house." So it gives them a sense of purpose as well, especially thinking about those countries that have less opportunities for livelihoods to go to work. So this is one of the ways that people try to find a sense of purpose. She defines militarized masculinities as the fusion of certain practices and images of maleness with the use of weapons, the exercise of violence, and the performance of an aggressive and frequently misogynist masculinity. So there's this physical and emotional indoctrination into militarized masculinities. So, for example, she talks about a man who put on his, quote, military face during an interview. As a result of being trained in this military face, they were often not able to get jobs because they looked like menacing and intimidating. And this reminds me of sometimes teenagers who put on a scowl to protect themselves from the world, but often hurt themselves when they're going for jobs in this world, right? In terms of the purpose of guns, guns are a threat and a source of security in a highly violent environment. Laying down weapons and trusting the police to protect them diminishes the men's capacity to protect their families in the event that armed actors come for them. So here's the problem. Former combatants have little access to civilian symbols of masculine prestige. Militarized masculinity produces a male that's only marketable in conflict. So they get skills that are only good for war. And the problem with that is that both men and women promote these violent masculine stereotypes in an effort to survive or to thrive. In this culture, women take on strong masculine men by selling themselves to them. And they do that because security is why. They do it because they seek them out to feel safe, okay? Yet, these stereotypes lead to the domestication of violence, a common phenomenon in post-conflict settings. This is why there needs to be a balance in the community when you're assisting both males and females, because if you don't address both, talking about gendered masculinity, then it won't get fixed. So one of the problems with the DDR program is that it's squarely located within a military or security framework, and it fails to give consideration to host communities and the needs to consider local, cultural, or gendered conceptions of what constitutes rehabilitation and resocialization of ex-combatants. So the recommendation is opening space for alternative masculinities and addressing the attitudes and behaviors of these former combatants and bringing conscious awareness to the gendered patterns of thought and conduct. So if you've read Fidelma Ash's article on militarized masculinities in Northern Ireland, then you got a good idea of what's known as the Troubles in Ireland. This is a video that shows you the indoctrination of violence and hate in young boys. So what I would like you to do is watch this video and put down what is important to note from this video, okay? I found it quite shocking to watch and was very surprising to me, and I would like to get your take on it too. So what is important to note when you watch this video, especially when it comes to militarized masculinities? So that's the end of the screencast. Next week, we're going to be looking at nonviolence. So you're going to read two of them are very short articles, one on radical Islam and nonviolence, which I hope will be as surprising to you as it was to me when I read it the first time. Kirk Schock's article, Nonviolent Action and Its Misconceptions. It's a super easy read. And then came out in April, Why You Should Never Underestimate a Bunch of Well-Organized Teenage Protesters. I found all three articles very interesting, not so hard to read at all. I hope you will enjoy them. And if you have any questions, I will be checking my email. I look forward to seeing you next week. Take care and be safe.